Okay, good morning and welcome to our online webinar. And this one is entitled COVID-19 Now What? Governing Strategy and Risk Within New Economic Realities. My name is Sarah Haffenden and I'm the Marketing Communications Manager at UKZN Extended Learning, also known as UEL. So in case you are unfamiliar with UEL, we are the continuing education unit of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and we offer all the short courses on behalf of the university. So we decided to offer these webinars as we're on full support and compliance with the directive of the national lockdown, which was issued to address the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have embraced the changes and have launched a number of projects aimed at providing free access to learning materials during this lockdown period. So one of these projects is our online learning webinars, and this webinar is the second part of a series, and part one is available on our website. So our webinars will continue throughout July and August and will be offered once a week on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. So please do take a look at our final slide at the end of this webinar for further details on upcoming webinars, or you can visit our website www.ukznextendedlearning.com. So please note that due to the nature of this webinar, we will not be able to address raised hands and questions throughout the presentation. So please would you post all comments and questions in the Q&A box, and this will be addressed at the end of the webinar. We will also allow for live questions at the end, so just raise your hand if you have a question you would like to ask live. So I'd now like to introduce you to our guest speaker for today, Marlon Moodley. So Marlon is the Managing Director of B2HA ICT Advisory. B2HA is an advisory firm working with clients in medium to large organizations in the public and private sector, and with institutions such as the Institute of Directors in Southern Africa and the Chartered Governance Institute in Southern Africa, formerly known as the CSSA. B2HA works with clients at board and C-level on technology, governance, strategy, risk, and compliance. His academic qualifications include a BCom from UKZN Pietermaritzburg, a BCom Honours from UNISA, MCom from UNISA, and MAP from WITS. Marlon also serves as a non-executive chairman and director of Power Matala ICT. So welcome, Marlon, and over to you.
Sarah, thank you very, very much. Good morning, everybody. I hope that you're well and staying safe wherever you are. Apologies for the little cough there. I didn't have it on mute as I was coughing. My apologies for that. Sarah, thank you for the introduction this morning. And everybody, I hope everything is well where you are and that things are starting to look up. In terms of our topic today, COVID-19, now what? Governing strategy and risk within new economic realities. Today is a little bit of a journey through strategy, and it's also a discussion on risk and how to actually look out for the things that you can do to mitigate and what you can do to mitigate. But before we do that, a short little introduction and a brief outline for the webinar for today. We're going to do a little bit of an introduction for those of you that haven't attended last week. So I'll do a short introduction into myself and what B2HA does. And then we'll go into a short poll before the main topic of this morning. And then we'll do some governance imperatives and some guidance in terms of where we see things going, a little bit of our perspective and how things are happening in the world and what you can start looking out for in terms of what you do in your organizations. And if you run your own business, the types of things that you should be looking out for there as well. So in terms of the introduction, B2HA works at board level in organizations. And for us, if we work at board and C-level, it's about being healthy as an organization. So if you have healthy leadership at the top, you'll have a healthy company. If you have unhealthy leadership, and we'll show a little bit about that in some of the slides later on, you'll have a company that performs poorly. So if you look at what's happened recently in the news with organizations such as SAA, we've now seen that Dudu Myeni was declared a delinquent director not long ago by the court. She is appealing that decision. But if you look at the judgment, it was a scathing judgment of how she handled and drove governance in the organization. And she was complicit along with other directors of doing things that they shouldn't have done. And if you look at where SAA is now, it's a company that's struggling and fighting for its survival, along with many other state-owned enterprises that are in the same position. And it's not necessarily just the private sector that has this problem, the public sector that has this problem. The private sector also has its share of nightmares, such as Steinhoff and Tonga Tulip in Durban, where problems with governance has actually resulted in very poor performance. And in terms of how organizations do these things, it's ultimately the stakeholders that suffer, not necessarily just shareholders, but also employees, because can they hold on to their jobs once organizations perform poorly, and are they able to survive into the future? So these are the types of things that V2HA helps with, and we actually have experience across a wide range of industries. And we don't just perform or provide unique perspective, but we also provide solutions in terms of we see what goes wrong, what's going wrong, and how you can get yourself out of that, and we guide you with that in terms of how you can actually move on beyond the problems that you experience. But ultimately, you've got to have healthy leadership or you're in trouble. In terms of me as your facilitator for this morning, I started out at PwC in Pietermaritzburg after my studies at UKZN, and initially started out in audit, and then I transferred to the national office in Johannesburg, where I was involved in management consulting, the management consulting practice, and we got involved in a lot of strategy, operations management work, consulting in those areas. Thereafter moved on to Eskom. Eskom at one point was was one of the world's leading utilities in energy and energy provision of energy services. And this was back in 2001 when it received the award. So it's hard to imagine how far Eskom has fallen from those lofty heights. And here again, it was governance and governance discipline, it was leadership, and it was interference from the main shareholder, and it was the leadership at the top that had actually ruined a company that was actually one of the best in the world at one point in time. Eskom, during my time at Eskom, I worked in Eskom's technology division in technology management, and we were responsible for commissioning some of the largest systems on the continent and even in the southern hemisphere at one stage. So Eskom did technology management and technology and systems very well. And around 2000, the government took a decision to take the technology divisions of Eskom, Transnet, and Denel out of those organizations and put it into a company called Arabia.com that was formed to then sell these services back to Eskom, Transnet, and Denel as an outsourced service provider. And it was a very, very strange journey in terms of outsourcing. Arabia.com was formed at the time when the dot-com bubble had burst. And basically what had happened from there on in was that parastatal managers were now required to be business executives in a newly formed company, and they were very, very poorly prepared for this type of role. Needless to say, Arabia.com didn't survive this and was later on sold off to T-Systems. I actually did my master's, my dissertation. It was a full research dissertation predicting that Arabia.com wasn't going to survive this, and there were strategic reasons behind why it wasn't going to survive. And while there were possibilities for Arabia to actually make a go of it, eventually it's because of our lack of leadership, the poor governance, and the competitive environment that we were in, it stood very little chance against hyper-competitive companies. And as you recall, if you recall, when the dot-com bubble burst, the technology industry globally had gone into consolidation. So there were many companies going after fewer technology opportunities in the market. So there was a state of hyper-competition, and Arabia.com was just not able to survive in a situation of hyper-competition. So after my time at Arabia.com, as a senior general manager, I actually moved on to Harmony Gold. I was appointed at Harmony Gold as the Group Chief Information Officer. For those of you who don't know much about the mining industry and Harmony is now the world's third largest gold mining group. It's listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, as well as New York, NASDAQ, London, as well as two other bourses in Europe. And it has a global footprint. It has some of the most valuable gold assets in the world in Southeast Asia, in Papua New Guinea mainly. And Harmony Gold, in the time that I was there, had a very, very interesting adventure in terms of poorly implementing an ERP system. I had actually been brought in at the time when they had actually started this project. I advised against it, and the company did not listen at the time. And I was Harmony ended up paying the price for this win, and this was a very public. It was covered in the media very well. Harmony was actually sued by its U.S. shareholders in a class action lawsuit as a result of this ERP system going badly out of shape, and we had to re-implement the system. And I was then, and this was my one of my other exposures at board level. I was then required to report at board level for the organization quarterly thereafter to fix the problem, and then to guide the group on strategy. So I was responsible for governance in the group, technology governance, technology strategy, running group technology for the company globally. And of course, we had to then account to the New York Stock Exchange and all our stakeholders thereafter that everything was then in order. So that was a very, very stressful time, but enormous valuable learning that came out of that. And thereafter, with the experience that I'd had with Eskom, Elevia.com, and Harmony especially, and with Rand Uranium at board level, I then started B2HA. And with partners in B2HA, we now then advise at board level and at executive level in the public sector and in the private sector. So that's a very, very short introduction. The bio is available on the UKZM site along with these slides from today. So, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of the webinar topic, what in the time of pandemics, COVID-19? So how do you manage governing strategy and risk within new economic realities? And in terms of the guidance that we'll be providing to boards, executives, company secretaries, and governance professionals today, we'll be talking and taking on a little journey around risk and strategy. And in terms of performance and compliance, those who form part of the overall governance framework that any organization should have. Now, when we talk about governance, it's often a swear word. It's often associated with ticking boxes and keeping files and files of spreadsheets about how you've actually liaised with departments and you've actually gotten your compliance set. But governance and compliance are not the same thing. Compliance is a subset of governance, and compliance refers more to how you comply with the law. Governance is about how organizations' leadership behave when it comes to running the organization and making it sustainable. So governance is actually around sustainability, and it's around how you behave responsibly, how you behave strategically, and how you make sure that the organization achieves world-class performance. So without much further ado, I'm going to get into the topic, but before we do that, I'm going to prompt Sarah now to run this morning's poll. So this is going to be the first of 3 questions that are going to be coming up. And the first question is, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on people's lives since the beginning of this year. Adapting has been difficult and frustrating. How do you feel right now about the future prospects? So right now it's 50-50. Please keep going. It looks very, very great. It looks very interesting. So we've had very good responses so far. We've had 72% of all participants now with votes almost in. Keep going. I'm going to give you a 5-second countdown in a few seconds. 1 or 2 are still coming in. Please keep going. I really appreciate your feedback on this, and then we'll share some of the polling online. So we're going to go into a 5-second countdown just now. It's 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, and we're going to close it just now, Sarah, and then we'll share the results. So I'm going to share the results, and from this poll, ladies and gentlemen, it's been very, very tight. 54% saying still unsettled but cautiously optimistic about the future. 46% unsure and uncomfortable. The future looks bleak. Thank you very much. That's actually very, very good of you to share that. And I think it gives an indication as to where we are right now as a country, and I think perhaps even globally. This is the type of journey that we are on now with COVID-19, where this is not something that we just feel within ourselves individually. If you're at home working from home right now, I'm pretty sure that it must feel sometimes that there doesn't seem to be any end to the doom and gloom. And if you watch media, and I've actually stopped watching media regularly because it sometimes affects your mood greatly. If you continue to watch the media, it's all doom and gloom about how our leaders are letting us down with some very, very poor decisions, and how the pandemic seems to be spreading unabated with no end in sight. So in terms of our topic for today, I'm just going to go through a very, very quick recap and for the picture on the economic reality in times of a pandemic. So the first few slides are around our recap from last week. You will recall, if you had attended last week's webinar, that I shared some of these slides with you in terms of what has happened with COVID-19 and how it's actually affected border closures, and how global export restrictions has actually been something that's affected the entire planet. And what it's done is that it's actually shown up vulnerabilities in our global supply chains and the way in which we've actually been accustomed to trading. And it's shown that we have now had this over reliance on outsourcing and manufacture, particularly to the Far East. And what COVID-19 has done is maybe not all that bleak, in that while it raises challenges, it also provides opportunities for us to look at how we provide raw materials, and raw materials can now be beneficiated. So in other words, instead of just pushing, taking these out of the ground through mining, or producing, for instance, cotton and other raw materials, sending it overseas to be for a value to be added there for us to then re-import it into the country. There are now opportunities for us to have local beneficiation where we add value locally and we create opportunities for us to sell locally as well as to then export goods of greater value overseas to our trading partners and to our neighbors in Africa and elsewhere in the world. So these decisions in tough times, as you can see with this next slide, governments around the world are starting to face some very, very serious decisions. Should we be saving jobs amid a pandemic, or should we be saving lives? And if you look at how certain countries have responded in this in the survey, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, etc., seem to be heavily in favor, all the way down to South Korea, seem to be heavily in favor of valuing health and lives over jobs, and that we could always recover and come back again a little while later. Whereas with China, who's actually had a head start in terms of dealing with the pandemic, they seem to be more in favor of opening up the economy. And as we've seen with China, they've had to shut down again recently temporarily as the virus spread, but these were to be expected, and governments around the world are getting guidance on those in terms of the numbers will go up, but then as they go up, then you can take certain temporary measures before you get getting back to business again. India as well, most notably China's neighbor, still heavily in favor of, despite the country's two populations being very similar, India is still in favor of actually staying in a state of lockdown until people can recover, as opposed to getting the economy started very too quickly. And of course, South Africa's numbers are rising. They were low until level 3, and now they've started to escalate hugely. Gauteng is a big problem area. There's huge angst about whether there will be a shutdown again. But in terms of where we are going now, it's still a pressing problem for government, and I think that it's a very difficult decision for governments to be facing. I don't envy our president at this point in time. He's faced with a difficult situation. It's damned if you do, damned if you don't. So as we go forward, tough decisions in tough times. And of course, with the global paranoia, tourism has been a big casualty in South Africa. It's a huge contributor to GDP, and we've been heavily dependent on the EU, the US, and Asia for tourism and tourism currency. And right now, it's been a big problem. And of course, some countries seem to be rolling the dice when it comes to taking on the global paranoia. Egypt, if you've watched the TV lately, has gone on a massive tourism drive, gone on a massive tourism ad campaign, and they've started to open up the economy. And we're still hamstrung by the growing numbers. But for us, the big problem is that our trading partners and our tourism base, which is largely Europe, has actually closed off borders and have restricted tourism or restricted travel from South Africa to the EU. So again, our problem, and vice versa. So again, our problems actually seem to be that while COVID is still prevalent, there's going to be a huge number of industries that are going to be affected by this. And as the world slowly opens up, manufacturing is now slowly started to happen again. As you can see with this slide from the US Census Bureau, manufacturing is now slowly starting to open up, but it's going to start to be affected with the growing numbers in certain states in the US, and they'll probably shut down again before another cautious opening. But then again, the urgency to restart economic activity is growing. And of course, with this slide, certain developing nations are not waiting around. So as you'll see with this slide in the next one with India and China, their online stores are now starting to boom. Businesses starting to actually take over in a big way over traditional businesses. And eventually the two we see will converge in that as traditional businesses learn to partner with organizations that are online to sell their services. For instance, if you have a local business in South Africa and if you have something that's of great value, you can actually start to have online platforms that will then deliver it to your customers. These are the types of things that India is starting to embrace in a big way, where more traditional businesses will start to use online platforms for the delivery of goods and services. As you can see with eBay, they expected quarter two revenues to grow, but by 16%. They're already starting to exceed initial estimates as well. So online services and online platforms really are really benefiting in ways that they didn't expect previously. China has recorded its highest revenues and solid future growth from e-commerce in ways that it didn't initially forecast. However, there are certain casualties in e-commerce. So the fashion industry has been suffering greatly. Of course, if you've got nowhere to go, there's no need for you to be dressing up in fancy clothing, etc., etc. And of course, furniture and appliances, food and personal care have also suffered a bit, although to a lesser extent. So, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to heightened risk, we're going to actually be talking a little bit now about heightened risk. And whilst that little background that we've given you was to actually recap a little bit from where we were last week, now we go into what risks are facing organizations, whether you're a small business, a one-man show, whether you're a medium enterprise, or whether you're a large enterprise, or whether you're in the public sector, where you have large numbers of employees. There is risk. And of course, amongst the key risks, and we're going to go through this fairly quickly, some of these that have now come up as a result of the pandemic are over-reliance on governments to save the day, working capital issues, particularly cash flow, resource effectiveness and future planning, how do you go about doing that, and business continuity. And of course, in terms of how things run, there's no script, there's no user guide on how to put these things together. We're going to have to wing it as we go along from here on in. COVID-19 has knocked us over for a six. The plans that we had last year, we're going to talk about that on strategy. The plans that we even had as recently as this year in February and March have now gone out of the window as a result of these unprecedented lockdowns globally. So talking about the first risk and the government governance. So when I talked about governance earlier, I talked initially about how governance is about human behavior. And if we look at where good governance starts, it's at the top. So good governance starts with responsible behavior. And if you have an over-reliance on governments to save the day, particularly in the current climate, I'm pretty sure you'll see, this has been fairly well covered across a wide range of media, how global leaders have actually let us down. So I don't know, I've just put up these now, and we'll take a little bit of, you're welcome to make your comments in the chat box later on during Q&A. But would you trust any of these leaders to do the right thing right now? And if you look at Brazil, if you look at the United Kingdom, if you look at the US, it's actually been pretty bad. And if you looked at the BBC this morning, you would see that top medical practitioners in the US, especially amongst the UK Royal Society of Medical Practitioners, they've actually widely advocated the use of masks going out into public. There's now a growing body of evidence that shows that wearing a mask not only protects you from other people, but yourself from to others if you're carrying the virus. So they widely advocate now the use of masks, and yet in the UK, they've been fairly slow to embrace this, and medical practitioners are now starting to push government to place huge pressure on them to start the use of masks. Now, in South Africa, we've been doing this for quite a while, but many developed countries have been struggling with this. If you look at the president of Brazil, he actually was recently forced by a court of law to wear a mask in public and to start being responsible in the way that he behaves. Donald Trump, I think we can say, has been well covered in the media in terms of how he's dealt with things. So governments are increasingly being seen as entities that you can't really trust. So you will have to do certain things for yourself if a government cannot assist you. So this is increasingly the message that is coming across. In terms of key risks in 2020 regarding working capital, I just put some wise words that I'd heard before up there. Just I can't remember who it was. So, but it was one of my colleagues previously. Was that, and this is something that has been said that's been covered. You could probably Google this as well. This turnover is vanity, profit is sanity, but cash flow is reality. If you don't have cash right now as a business, you're going to struggle. And this affects your ability to continue operating. Your ability to raise finance from banks and lenders. There's also a problem that affects your working capital. And these are the types of things that you'll now need to plan for into the future. So it's a huge risk currently. How do you manage your suppliers in terms of payback periods? If you're a large organization, how are you dealing with your small, medium, and micro enterprises in terms of better terms? And are you able to work with them to come through in tough times? Because a lot of these enterprises may be small, but they may be providing valuable goods and services to you. And if you are unable to help them to survive, their failure will mean that they will ultimately impact on you. So it's a circle, it's a vicious circle. So we all depend on each other, and it's a lot of teamwork and cooperation amongst entities, businesses, and individuals in South Africa that will get us through a crisis. And these are the key risks in terms of how you actually do this. How do you manage your resources as well? So your human capital, will they stay or will they go? Will they find better opportunities? Will they start their own businesses? And will they spot valuable opportunities which they can take advantage of and then move on and leave you in the lurch? Are you able to retain them? Are you able to change mode in a crisis, in another pandemic? Can you accommodate flexible working arrangements and enabling your resources to work offsite? Are you able to trust them to work offsite? And of course, amongst our most valuable of resources also our customers. Will they stay? Will they pay? Can you reach new markets and new services? And can you find new customers in different businesses? Will you be a different business in a year from now? Will you work differently a year from now? And I'd like to hear your views on that during Q&A as well. I'd like to hear your comments on it. So in terms of the other businesses, business continuity, if you look at that stat from Continuity Central, 87.5% of organizations, this was a survey taken in the US, UK, and Australia very recently, indicated that they intend spending the same as they did in 2019 or more in terms of business continuity measures. So these are businesses that are intending to actually take greater measures into the future or intend to actually invest heavily in them in order to make sure that they survive into the future. And this will mean a lot of soul searching amongst organizations in terms of their strategy about how they actually move beyond the current crisis. Technology, scalability, and flexibility is a key risk in enabling you to change or pivot. So this is one of those things that must be enable you to switch working mode from one mode of working to another. So if you have invested heavily in lovely offices and you're able, and you've all got and if you insist on all of your staff working at the offices, what happens in a pandemic? Are you able to pivot into a new mode of working? Are people able to work offsite? If you're in a manufacturing entity, are you able to switch between different lines of goods that you and products that you manufacture? Are you able to cycle between your workers in terms of who comes to work and who doesn't, and on which days? Are you able to manage these schedules effectively? And of course, it all depends on your leadership quality. Are you able to assess your risk and plan for the future? And in terms of leadership quality, it's a strategic matter, but not strategy in itself. These are the types of things that you will need to do to change, and you'll need to change your behavior in order to move forward and to manage this risk more effectively. So these 4 risks that we've identified now are just a few amongst a number of them. And these actually talk to your ability to look at some things that affect your business and that can kill your business right now. So, ladies and gentlemen, before we move into the next bit on strategy, I'm going to prompt Sarah again in terms of the next poll. And in this question, if another pandemic hits in the next year, I aim to lead my business or organization with the following mindset. So in terms of this, how are you planning to lead the organization if another pandemic hits? I'll take it as it comes, each person for themselves. Here we go again, everyone run for your lives. Or is it, I'm planning for the future, it's a team effort. If it happens, we will be prepared. Why should I care? It's the government's problem to look after us. We pay our taxes. So I'd really like your views on that. So you've got the 3 options there again. 1, if another pandemic hits, I'll take it as it comes, each person for themselves. 2, I'm planning for the future and it's a team effort. 3, why should I care? I pay my taxes. The government should be looking out for us. I didn't cause this problem. So right now, some very, very good responses coming through. Keep going. We're going to do a 5-second countdown. We've got a little while yet. I'd really like to hear more. We've had some good responses so far. So far, some excellent responses. Quite a number of you have responded. 55% have voted thus far. So keep going. I'd really like to hear more from this, and then we'll share the results shortly. So we're up to 65%. Keep going, guys. You're doing well so far. And we'll go into a 5-second countdown in a few seconds. But yeah, so if another pandemic hits in the next year, how would you or you lead your organization? What type of mindset do you intend having around this? And we're going to go into the 5-second countdown now. It's 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And Sarah, we can close that poll off and share the results. So I'm going to share those results, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see from it, 92% say, I'm planning for the future. It's a team effort. So if it happens, we'll be prepared. And 8% say, I'll take it as it comes, each person for themselves. Oh, hello. Here we go again. Run for your lives, people. So 8% say, well, I'll take it as it comes. Thank you for that. I really appreciate the participation there. And it will be interesting to see how you respond in the final poll that will be coming up towards the end of the presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've been through risks. We've covered some risks. And as we've seen with the pandemic, it seems to be a pretty grim picture. But does it need to be so? Is it necessarily so? Is there a way for us to move forward into the future? And how do you do this? So strategy has a role to play in this. Now, for a lot of us, strategy has this, there's a perception of strategy of it's a thick document, it's something that you need to get consultants in to help you with. Well, actually, consultants do play a vital role in this area. But strategy and strategic thinking is not quite what we always seem to think it is. And for that, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go through a small recap now, and then I'm going to take you through a very interesting story of Honda USA and what happened to Honda and how it almost bankrupted the company. So in terms of strategy and planning, again, in terms of last week's webinar, I'd actually put up a quote from Mike Tyson, which is everybody has a plan until they get hit. The other variants that he's used over the years as he's been interviewed, when he was asked to clarify, says, well, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And what he was saying there was that when you get into the ring, what happens is that you have a plan. You think that you've planned it out. You've worked with your team. You think you have the right type of plan in place to face an opponent. And everything seems to go well until the opponent lands a punch. And Mike Tyson says that every opponent that you fight with needs to land just one punch to knock you out, and there goes all your plans. So basically, when it comes to strategy, it's very much the same thing. If the last document that you had was just a thick document, what will your next steps be? When was the last time you had a look at your strategy? Everybody who's been even in a small business would have written down at some point in time, this is what I intend to do. But how often do you revise that? How often do you look at it? How often do you do deep soul searching? I'm pretty sure amongst you, and there are quite a few of you attending today, is that you would have done this at some point in time. But do you often go back and assess and look at what has happened recently over the past month, over the past week, over the past quarter, over the past year? How often do you do your assessments to see what is really happening? And how often do you look at your plans to see whether it needs constant reworking? Because these types of plans need constant reworking, and I'll show you why in a little bit. So in terms of our pandemic, and in terms of strategic thinking around it, if you're a large business, how often do you do your research to see what's coming along? If you look at our pandemic that we've now shared globally, this is something that we all share. This is something that we all seem to have in common globally. Every single one of us has been impacted regarding this around the planet in some way. And if you look at who saw it coming, Bill Gates had talked about Ebola in 2014, and in 2015, when he gave a TED talk, had given a deeply insightful one. And ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to actually look at this TED talk. It was deeply insightful in that he talked about how the next event that was likely to shake the planet and affect the way in which our way of life is going to be affected is not going to be a world war, but it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus. And why he said that was that most governments around the world had spent heavily on military preparedness over the last 100 years. And especially in the last 30 to 40 years, we've spent a lot on military preparedness. But we've done actually very little on looking at whether a pandemic can affect us. So we've done a lot of work on the military front, but we have done nothing on the pandemic front. So we were funding and waiting for war to appear on the wrong front. So basically, can we then better survey the landscape to see what comes along? And of course, if this information is now available, we're living in a time of information availability. What the technology, information technology has done is made a lot of information available to us very readily and very easily. Is that can we now survey the landscape to see what's coming along? And of course, that brings us then to how we plan for strategy, how we strategize for the future, how we plan around preparing our businesses for sustainability. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take you through a very, very short story of Honda USA. And basically, with Honda, if you recall, after World War II, the Japanese economy had been devastated. Most businesses had actually faced ruin. If you look, if you remember, if you recall from history and your history lessons in school, Japan had been bombed by the U.S. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. Those economies and the people and the social infrastructure of those islands had actually been devastated. And basically, what had happened was that Japan had then heavily invested after World War II, from the late 1940s going into the 1950s. They invested heavily in industrialization, and like China has done over the last 30 to 40 years, they saw global trade as the way for them to actually move out of the poor economic state. So Honda was amongst the organizations that had done very well locally in Japan with their brand, and they intended to then start going into the US market. And something very interesting had happened between 1959 and 1973. And what had happened was that the story starts with the British government commissioning the Boston Consulting Group in the 1960s, in the 1970s, to look into what had happened in terms of the decline of the British motorcycle industry, especially with companies that were now exporting to the USA. And what had happened was that they asked the Boston Consulting Group to look into what had happened, because the British manufacturing industry had occupied a lion's share of exports, and between Britain and the US, the economy for cycles, the market for motorcycles in the US has been fairly large, but in between Indian motorcycles, Harley Davidson, Triumph, and Norton, they had actually occupied 49% of the market share of the US motorcycle market. But what had happened was that between 1959 and 1973, it had declined from 49% to 9%. And when the Boston Consulting Group had come in, they'd done an in-depth study. And according to one of the report that they issued to the British government, they had found that Honda had actually had a meteoric rise in the US market. And it was as a result of a deliberate strategy. They were highly competitive in Japan and held a very large and very successful cost position. They were able to manufacture at very high volume at very low production cost. And that's why they were able to take advantage of this. And when they got into the US market, they had a significant competitive advantage. And the domestic producers, Harley Davidson and Indian at the time, as well as Norton and Triumph, stood no chance. So this was the Boston Consulting Group's report. And what happened was that they went on with this report to say how the Japanese were highly disciplined. They had actually continued with their businesses despite all of the adversity that they'd had, and it was endemic to their culture, and that they were very successful in what they do, and anything that they'd set their minds to, they were very successful at. And so in terms of where they were, they had actually reached an untenable position. They had reached an insurmountable position in terms of their manufacturing capability. So that's why Norton, Triumph, etc. had actually stood no chance. So it was a blah, blah, blah on the report. They gave massive reasons behind it. Typically, very similar to how you would find these types of reports today from a typical Big Five or Big Four consulting firm. However, if you actually look at Honda's story, and this was covered very well by Robert Pascal in his book Perspectives on Strategy, the real story behind Honda's success. When he looked at all of the Boston Consulting Group reports and data, and he then went to and interviewed Honda in Japan, he actually found a completely different story. He found actually a chalk and cheese type of scenario. And what had happened was that when Honda intended to actually go into the US market, they were actually urged by the Japanese government, and this was the Japanese Ministry of Trade and Industry, that were responsible for providing grants for Japanese companies to export abroad and to set up businesses abroad. He found an amazing story where the MITI had urged Honda to stick to its Japanese market, and in fact, they said that Toyota had actually performed so poorly with a product called the Toyopet in the US market years earlier that it was actually a disgrace, and that Honda would actually go and would probably find the same type of problem, and that they should actually just stick to Japan and not even bother. So the Japanese government were actually talking Honda out of going abroad because of Toyota's problems with the Toyopet Crown. And so the MITI decided to go one step further, and in the bid to help Honda to not suffer from humiliating defeat when they go to the US, they decided to restrict Honda's cash that it could take abroad and the amount of motorcycles and parts. So they restricted their Honda at the time to $110,000 in cash and $140,000 worth of motorcycle and parts. And basically, when the Honda managers were interviewed by Robert Pascal, they actually said that we were so strapped for cash that the three of us shared an apartment, for a furnished apartment, and rented for for $80 a month. Two of us slept on the floor, so the managers slept on the bed and the workers slept on the floor, and no idea of what we were doing. We had no idea what we were doing when we entered the US market. So basically, what had happened with that last point on the slide was that they entered and started setting up the site as the US market went into its winter. So when you go into winter, you sell far fewer motorcycles. In the North America, it gets extremely cold. So it's very difficult and very dangerous to ride a motorcycle then. So they actually went at a time when it was one of the absolute worst times to actually sell motorcycles in the US. And the problems didn't stop there. In terms of what had happened was that the components and the engines that they brought and the motorcycle models that they brought, the larger models that they sold were actually starting to fail. Customers were bringing them back. On the right-hand side, you can see Honda America Motors' very first shop. They had actually bought a photograph processing facility. It was a very small shop where you took your photographs to be processed. They bought this facility, and that was Honda's headquarters in the US. It was very humble beginnings. And what had happened was that as customers were bringing back bikes saying, listen, these bikes are not good quality at all, Honda had to send these bikes back to to Japan to be reworked. They had to send back parts that were defective so that the factory could actually figure out what was going on. They found out that it was the quality of the clutches that were on these bikes were starting to fail after a little while. And what they found was that because in the United States, customers use bikes differently from how they use them in Japan. So they rode them longer and faster. So they put a lot of the engine and components under considerably more stress than they were used on the Japanese and in Japan, which is a series of islands where the streets are narrow. You don't have long winding roads or long stretches at which where you put motorbikes under heavy load. So basically, once Honda's factory said that, look, it's going to take a while to sort the problem out, but we do know what these problems are. And so the Japanese managers that were in America at the time were starting to have a huge problem, didn't know what to do next, until they accidentally discovered that customers were actually quite interested in their smaller bikes. Now, if you look at the little picture down at the bottom, that's the Honda Super Cub. And what had happened was that they were brought, the Honda managers and workers had actually brought this to America so that they could use them as personal transportation to go between the Honda warehouses and the customers that they were selling to. And so they use it as per mobile transportation. And they were very popular in Japan, but they didn't think that they would sell in the US. However, a buyer from Sears and a whole lot of other smaller supermarket chains actually became very interested in these bikes. As soon as they saw them, they actually thought that it was something that could be used for, especially for females, because more and more females were entering the workforce. And so they saw these as something that could be used for females. And so what happened was that after a while, initially after saying no to Sears and to these smaller supermarket chains, the managers decided to call back to head office and say, look, a lot of people are calling for these bikes. Can we sell them? And what the head office decided was, listen, we don't have any business at the moment. Sell these things. We learn and adapt as we go along. As we're correcting these other things, we're miles away from doing it. We're at least 6 to 8 months away from getting these larger bikes back to you with better quality clutches. Sell these bikes. Honda then went and started to sell them initially in small quantities, and then business boomed. And so much so that they went on a larger advertising campaign. And on the right hand side, you'll see in the 1960s, you had this ad campaign. It was a very famous ad campaign saying that you meet the nicest people on a Honda. So the Super Cub was actually a breakout success that they didn't expect. So basically, what happened in Honda's case was that they had to adapt and learn as they went along. And ladies and gentlemen, that's actually our guidance on strategy for you. Now, there are numerous examples of this. IKEA is another example of this, where IKEA, it's not a retailer that's actually has presence in South Africa or in Africa. It's very well known in Europe and the US and Australia. But in IKEA is a Swedish brand, and their CEO realized that in terms of how they produced and delivered furniture to customers, eventually they came to a knockdown coming with a semi-knockdown model where they actually sell flat pack furniture where you can assemble it at home. You buy it at IKEA and you can sell it at home. And it was only after watching an employee taking apart and dismantling a desk that wouldn't fit into a delivery vehicle that the CEO realized that, hold on, we could be doing something else here with the way in which we work in order to deliver value for our customers. So in terms of our guidance on strategy, when you talk about strategy, when you strategize for your business, whether it's a small business, whether it's a medium business, whether it's a large business, whether you're growing as a business entity right now, you intend to start out with something. On here it is on the left hand side with the arrow. You would like to realize something, and you have a very deliberate way in which you do it. A lot of things won't work. So you've got to go back to the drawing board. Eventually, as you go along, and it's a cycle, there will be other things that inform you on how you should actually be doing things. And I put luck and risk down here because any business that you go into will always be associated with risk, but there will always be some sort of luck that comes along that will help you. Now, if you don't believe in luck, you're most welcome to. But the thing is that not everything that you do will be dependent on your actions only. There will always be an element of luck. And eventually you will come to something that starts to work, and that becomes your realized strategy. And you're going to keep working at it, but it's a cycle. It's constantly evolving. And as I'd spoken to you about earlier, if you had done a strategy that you haven't reviewed in the last year, it's actually a block of paper that's pretty useless because things have changed as you go along. You may be one of those businesses where nothing's changed and your strategy is great. That's good for you. And I'd love to hear from you about that if it is. But for the majority of businesses, you've got to constantly work on it. So basically how it works is that you have an image in your mind, a goal or a mental picture. You intend to actually set out to do something with that to achieve that goal. And not everything will work out as you plan. So you need flexibility as you go along. Things will change as you evolve. So you need to stay focused. You need to reflect on these things and think things through. And then you've got to go back to the drawing board and you've got to constantly work on the things that you've got. Sometimes it may not work out as well as you planned, and you need to go back and rework the image. So it's a constant cycle of rethinking your business. You've got to think about other things as you go along, and you've got to think about how things will happen, for instance, in times of pandemics. So further guidance on strategy is that it's about evolution. How do you actually look at the things that you do? How do you constantly evolve it? If you look at LVMH, now this is Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, this is a luxury brand, which is it's amongst the largest in the world. They decided to pivot away when they realized that the demand for their goods was starting to dry up as a result of the pandemic and lockdown. They decided to move into hand sanitizers. How could they use the existing manufacturing facilities to produce something for the greater good? A large portion of hand sanitizers that they produced have actually been donated free to hospitals and healthcare facilities and to other frail care facilities. What they've been doing with that is that they intend to do good, but they're growing their brand. So even during the lockdown, even though your manufacturing facilities may be repurposed for something else, you're still growing your brand because lockdown will end, and the LVMH brand will have then created great demand as a result of the good that they've done. And people will remember these things as you move forward to the future. So they don't stop being in the public eye as a result of the lockdown. They've used the opportunity to different ends. So if your plans will work out first time around, you need to create business resilience and you need to have persistence as you go along. And you've got to differentiate between working in your business and working on the business. So will you be doing different business tomorrow or next year? Will you be doing different, will you have different products? Will you be in a different mindset as you go along? So risk and failure viewed differently are gateways to greater achievement. That's something that we just contributed. That's one of our quotes. And of course, in terms of guidance and strategy, strategy is no longer about corporate strategy aligned to operation strategy, aligned to IT strategy. It's about how do you develop strategy for the digitally driven organization. And ladies and gentlemen, in terms of our guidance and strategy, this quote from Nelson Mandela, I never lose, I either win or I learn. That is about how you change your mindset. That is about how you reorient yourself to say that, look, not everything is doom and gloom. We will learn, we will move on from this. The next time around, we'll do better. And this coming from our former president, a most revered leader, somebody who could teach all other leaders around the world a thing or two about doing the right thing. Cyril, I think, is doing a good job in that regard as well. I think that Nelson Mandela, as an elder, has great wisdom to impart with the rest of the world, even now in terms of his quotes. And this is a great one in terms of strategy, in terms of how we do things as a business. I never lose. I either win or I learn. It's something great for us to actually take into the future. So as we go into the Q&A section, ladies and gentlemen, we're now towards the tail end of the presentation. I'd actually like, I'd like to prompt Sarah to run the next poll. Sarah, if you can bring it up, thank you very much. And this question is, the business climate and economy has been deeply impacted by the pandemic. Which of the following do you think could help create an environment of growth and prosperity beyond the devastation? So again, the options are government stimulus packages to large businesses to stop retrenchments and create more jobs. The second option is urgently developing entrepreneurs and the small business sector. The last one is a one-off payment example of around 2,500 to all South Africans by the government to stimulate economic activity. So 31% of you have started to vote already. So right now there is a clear favorite, but there is some that are coming up with the other options as well. So again, so in terms of the business climate and economy, it's been deeply impacted by the pandemic. Which of the following do you think would help create an environment of growth and prosperity beyond the devastation? So government stimulus packages to large businesses to stop retrenchments and create more jobs. So far, 11% for that one. Right now, 80% have gone with urgently developing entrepreneurs and the small business sector. So that's 80%. And 10% have gone for you thus far on a one-off payment example, 2,500 to all South Africans by the government to stimulate the economy. So right now, 62% of you have voted. So if you could please all vote, I'd really appreciate you if you could all vote, I'd really appreciate it. We're going to go into a 5-second countdown just now, and it's 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And Sarah, I think we can end the polling there. And if I could share the results. So ladies and gentlemen, right now it's at 82% saying urgently develop entrepreneurs and the small business sector. 9% have said, so it's an even tie. 9% have said government stimulus packages to large businesses to stop retrenchments and create more jobs. And a one-off payment, 9% have said a one-off payment example, 2,500 rand to all South Africans by the government to stimulate the economic activity. So we'll end that one there, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll go into the Q&A section now, and we'll spend a few minutes on that. We'll go a little bit past 11 o'clock because last week quite a few questions did come through on that. And in terms of Q&A, we'll be there just now. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to go to one of the last slides quickly. Labuyo has raised his hand. So Labuyo, we're going to go to, if you can get to Q&A. I don't know if we can get to...
Okay, you want him to ask this question now?
Yes, that's fine, please.
Okay, I'm unmuting you, Laveo, if you can just unmute yourself too.
Good morning.
Hi, Laveo, can you speak up? It's very faint.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. I think one of the questions that I want to raise in terms of strategy from a governance and the operation strategy point of view, where you see that sub businesses are actually um, sizing down or cutting heads in terms of retrenchment. So the difficulty with that now is since this period, um, they're cutting heads and they're using COVID as the reason for that. But then what happens when COVID goes? Because we found that majority of the business is not automated, if I can put it like that. So basically, what I'm trying to say is you've got a lot of hands on deck where you've got a lot of workforce who's not skilled, and then as from how do you then prepare for the future post COVID with that workforce?
Okay. Look, it's a good question. I think it's a question that's facing a lot of companies right now. And when it comes to the management of risk, when I talked about how do you manage your resources, especially cash flow, the big problem that most organizations have had is that in terms of cash flow, they've actually been unable to sustain themselves. A lot of organizations can't cope with the lockdown right now, so they're teetering on the edge. So that's where the retrenchments come in. That's where the letting go of staff comes in, or they just completely fold. If you look at, for instance, organizations such as SAA, right now they are desperately in need of a government bailout because they just can't. They're not able to launch any flights, so their assets are sitting on the ground, and in the meantime, they're incurring all of these costs, including labor costs. So these are the types of things governments have to think about clearly. SAA is now seriously considering a sell-off. So when it comes to strategy in future, amongst the key things that you need to look at, I mean, especially if you're a small business, is how am I able to keep myself going for at least 3 to 6 months if no income comes in? How am I able to keep the lights on? Am I able to pay salaries? If I'm a one or a two-man show, am I able to keep myself going? Can I meet my daily, weekly, and monthly expenses for 3 to 6 months until I get back on my feet? Can I change to a different way of working to keep myself going? So in the case of, for instance, LVMH, I used that example just now, Louis Vuitton. They had actually started manufacturing hand sanitizer. So they're getting a little bit of income. They're getting a little bit of government support in to do these things. So it keeps them going for a little while. It's not how they do business, but they've had to change because they were faced with the option of completely closing down during this time, and then the consequences are harder later on. To your point, though, or to your question, so organizations, when they do start up again, when the economy gets going, and after we find a vaccine, and I do remain hopeful that we'll find a vaccine, the big problem is now, how do you find those resources again? Because if you let a resource go now, they will eventually find something else to do. And if they're a valuable resource, the chances of you being able to get them back again is going to be remote. So these are things that organizations will need to start thinking about as they go forward.
Okay.
So I don't know, I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, he says thanks, Marlon, on the chat.
Excellent. Got it.
Okay, so if anyone else has any other questions they would like to ask Marlon, now's the chance. You can raise your hand or you can type something in the Q&A box. In the meantime, I'm just going to launch the final poll where you can rate the webinar for today. But if anyone else has any questions, please would you either type them up or raise your hand.
Okay, so if they know, so we'll keep it going for another minute or two, Sarah, as the
Okay.
polls come in. So a lot of people are voting at the moment.
But do remember, if you do think of something, there is an opportunity for you to type up or email through a question that we can then pass on to Marlon. But otherwise, I'm going to end the polling. Thank you very much. It looked like it's very good and good for today. Thanks.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much for
Marlon.
those votes, everybody. Really
Okay.
appreciate that. In terms of extended learning, ladies and gentlemen, these are some of the exciting webinars coming up. And I'd urge you, today's slides are available on the UKZN Extended Learning website, along with interesting information. There's contact information as well for Sindisiwa and for Vanusha. And if you look at the webinars coming up, there's some very, very nice topics coming up over the next few weeks. And of course, please look at the other exciting courses, some very, very valuable courses coming up from extended learning over the next little while. Excuse me.
Yeah, so thank you.
If you've got the time now, why not improve your marketability in terms of attending some of these lovely courses from UKZN? Some really, really good courses, really, really, really good education. It's well worth your investment. You're investing in your future. And of course, if you need to contact me, you're welcome to contact me via LinkedIn.
Okay, thanks so much, Marlon. Thank you for sharing with us today. And if you want to find out more about board leadership in specific, Marlon does facilitate on our board leadership program. So thank you, Marlon, for sharing with us today. And thank you so much to all our attendees for joining us and engaging in our webinars. So as I said in the beginning, the video and the slides will be available on the UEL website, and we'll be sending out this link to you later on this afternoon. Do take note of the upcoming webinars and do RSVP to secure your place. The webinar that was meant to take place last week Thursday will be taking place this week Thursday, as Zintle has recovered. So her final part of her webinar series will be taking place this Thursday. And then next week, Tuesday, we have Dr. Dave Beatty joining us again on the Marketing Your Personal Brand in the COVID-19 Era webinar. So do RSVP for these webinars, and we will also be sending out reminders. So we're also
much, Sarah. Sorry, Sarah, continue. Sorry.
No problem, thanks. So we're also offering a few online courses that for free during the lockdown period. So we've shared some of our own courses, as well as we've partnered with other organizations in order to provide free access. So please visit our website, www.ukznextendedlearning.com, to see what we have on offer. Otherwise, we hope that you enjoyed the session today, and we'll see you next time.
And to any participants who wish to contact me on LinkedIn or via our company contact, it's info@b2ha.co.za. And please look us up and check us out on LinkedIn as well. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, A. Bye.
All the best. Bye.